being recorded.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Pacific Sociological Association Lightning Talk. Today's topic is drug use and abuse, sociological implications for the decriminalization of substance in the U.S. My name is Manuel Barajas. I'm a professor at Sacramento State. I'm also the co-founder of the Center on Race, Immigration, and Social Justice. Let me read the description of the event. The current landscape of laws governing illegal substances in the U.S. has undergone significant transformation, reflecting changing societal attitudes, public health considerations, and economic factors. The presenters in the third PSA Lightning talk examine the shift from punitive approaches characterized by stringent drug prohibition, criminalization, to more progressive policies emphasizing decriminalization, harm reduction, and legalization. The presenters also discuss the implications of these changes on criminal justice and social equity, suggesting that while progress has been made, challenges remain in addressing the historical injustices associated with drug law as they intersect with race, gender, and class groups. We have two participants. The first one, Professor Scott Akins, is at Oregon State University and specializes in criminology, deviance, drug use, and policy. He is author and co-author of studies on the topic of drugs and policies. His books include Drugs and Drug Policy, The Control of Consciousness Alteration, and the second one is In the Weeds, Decriminalization, Legalization, and the Evolution of U.S. Marijuana Policy. Some articles include Oregon just decriminalized all drugs, here's why voters passed this groundbreaking reform, and recreational marijuana legalization in Washington State, outcomes, benefits, and harms. He also has several awards for teaching and mentoring. When asked why he got into the field of study criminology, he answered, quote, I became interested in the field as I was a bit of a juvenile delinquent growing up. After experiencing criminal behavior in law enforcement from the other side, I became very interested in studying the behavior, why it occurs, and what can be done to prevent it. Our second participant is Alex Wyse. He's a doctoral student in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. His interests revolve around social inequalities, including incarceration, addiction, homelessness, the criminalization of mental health conditions, and how racial and class inequalities shape these experiences. His previous research experience includes qualitative work around the impacts of punitive measures in criminalization for people with diagnosed substance abuse disorders. Prior to graduate school, Alex worked for 6 years as a clinic clinician in the substance use treatment field in both residential and outpatient co-chlorine facilities. As a previously systems impacted individual, Alex's sociological imagination centers on social justice and abolition-oriented framework with focus on grassroots and community organizations being at the heart of larger systemic change. Each panelist will have 15 to 20 minutes to share their presentations, and the remaining time can be used for questions and answers. So let us welcome Scott and Alex, and welcome. And I think, Scott, you can begin.
Great, thank you, Manuel. Nice job on some of the Google research on me. I was like, where did some of that background come from? But I know that's buried in the internet somewhere. Hello, everybody. My brief talk today is going to cover some of the basics of drug policy and the rationale for the decriminalization of substances. This will also include a short review of Oregon's Measure 110, which decriminalized all drugs in Oregon for a short time. I'll provide a brief summary of why it largely failed and what we can learn from the experience. First off, note that drug possession crimes are among the most highly discretionary of crimes that are oftentimes felonies. The possession of hard drugs in most places is a felony, which means it's a crime with possible punishment of more than a year in prison. Most serious crimes in American society are crimes against persons. These are crimes of violence like murder, assault, or sexual assault, or serious crimes against property like burglary or car theft. For these crimes, there is a victim who directly suffers as a result of the crime. Drug possession crimes are not like this. They're often motivated by addiction, and they're enforced differently with undercover work and policing where people pose as drug sellers, etc. They're also not enforced equally across place and person, and this, as much as anything, is what motivates calls for policy reform in this area. Many oh, excuse me, I need to share my screen. Forgive me, I'm a bit of a Luddite and not great with this stuff. Okay, that should be coming through, correct? Great, thanks. Apologize, I'm quite slow with that stuff. Okay, so let's see here. Many in drug policy, including myself, advocate for a policy approach that is based in harm reduction. And so harm reduction is an approach that shifts the primary goal of drug policy from eliminating or even reducing drug use in some cases to reducing the harm associated with both drug use and policies designed to regulate drug use. Advocates of harm reduction are going to emphasize the importance of weighing the damage that is done both by the response to drug use as well as the damage that is done by the drug itself. So this may involve revising laws about drug possession and the associated penalties, which would include decriminalization. But oftentimes it will also involve policy that is designed to not necessarily alter the law in terms of how it approaches people that are charged with various drug possession crimes, but rather other types of ancillary types of outcomes that are associated with drug use. So this might involve things like needle exchange, where people can take in needles and exchange them for clean ones to minimize the spread of, HIV or hepatitis or other bloodborne illnesses. Easy access to naloxone or Narcan, which is an opioid reversal medication. Drug purity testing, so people can know basically what is in their concoction of drugs. There's a variety of them. Many times these are also banned. And a lot of times the reason that they are banned is that it tends to be perceived as signaling in some way that it is an area that is tolerant of drug use. And a lot of times people are not in support of that. All right, another important thing to note is what decriminalization is and what decriminalization is not. There are many legal and quasi-legal approaches to regulating drug use and its harms. Criminalization is what we have most experience with in the United States, which is the practice of handling drug possession crimes with legal penalties up to and including incarceration. This was and remains largely the practice that we have in the United States. Just as a little bit of a personal experience, when I was a college undergraduate in Arizona in the 1990s, the possession of any amount of marijuana was a felony with a mandatory minimum sentence. Now it's legal there, all right? And so we see a lot of shift in these things over time, but we still see criminalization by and large the way that we handle hard drug use in most states in the United States. De facto decriminalization is an informal but systematic practice of not enforcing typically possession laws. So you won't find this anywhere on the books, but in many jurisdictions, this is what is done. Police just will not cite people when they catch them with drugs or other things. They'll handle it some other way. Decriminalization, which we are talking about largely in this talk, is really better termed depenalization, right? And this is because it removes this form of conduct, in this case, drug possession, previously defined as criminal, from the jurisdiction of criminal justice agencies, but it is still, you can still be met with a various types of punishment, mostly a civil infraction like a fine or some type of court-ordered mandate to receive treatment or something like that. All right, but you are not able to receive incarceration in response to it. And the last is legalization, which is a massive step in terms of procedurally from decriminalization. It removes all criminal and civil penalties, but it obviously requires that a substance must be produced, regulated, taxed, and always regulated by the state. And that is very, very complicated. Okay. So what are some of the policy arguments for decriminalization? First and foremost, it's that drug prohibition has failed. The deterrent effect of strict criminal sanctions on drug use, okay, so those a marginal effect above what would already be a sanction that would be in place is small. All right, there's a very small deterrent effect if it exists at all for drug crimes. This is for a variety of different circumstances or a variety of different reasons, but the deterrent effect is especially ineffective on people that are young, which is the majority of all drug users, or people that are unattached in a variety of different ways, whether, career, family, what have you, okay? What we found consistently is that informal, meaning non-criminal sanctions are superior. So hard drug use especially comes with all sorts of consequences to health, to personal relationships, and research has consistently found that it is those things that cause people to quit when they eventually do not criminal sanctions, okay? We also know that globally, the US has the highest rate of incarceration and it has among the highest rates of illegal drug use. We have about 20% of people incarcerated in the United States that are in primarily for a drug crime. And it's very expensive to incarcerate somebody, an absolute minimum of $50,000 a year, and it may run as high as $100,000. And so in some part, we just choose to use that money elsewhere. The second, to that point, decriminalization is going to put money to better use. You're talking about just a massive number of criminal justice contacts when you're dealing with drug abuse violations, all right? They represent twice the number of all violent crimes combined. And this is with us pulling back, legalizing marijuana, et cetera. Until recently, it was 3 times the number of all violent crimes combined. So you're spending a lot of resources dealing with these types of offenses that are oftentimes motivated by either personal choice, sometimes by addiction, et cetera. Regardless, they're not things that are easily deterred or prevented by criminal sanctions. And we can use that money elsewhere. We can use that money on other things that are more directly harmful to communities, and that there's more normative consensus that these things should be handled with police response. And the last major issue, or the last major argument for this, is that the drug war targets people of color. We have known this for a while. Punitive drug laws disproportionately impact minority populations and members of the lower class. These differences cannot be explained by use patterns. Multiple sources of data, including major national surveys such as the Monitoring the Future Project and the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, find that adult whites, blacks, and Hispanics, for example, use illegal drugs at comparable rates, but consequences consistently fall more heavily on people of color. It's incredibly damaging to the relationship between police and these communities. This adversely affects crime rates in all sorts of ways in these communities, because most of responses to criminal activity are calls for service, and so it decreases trust, it decreases calls for service in this area. And so this is probably the most significant argument as far as why we want decriminalization. This brings us to Measure 110. So in 2020, Oregon became the first state in the United States to decriminalize the possession of all drugs after a ballot initiative, all right? Passed with about 58% of the vote. This took place in early 2021, and it lasted about partway through 2024, ended basically in early 2024. So under 110, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, and all other drugs for personal use, possession of those drugs was not a criminal offense, but you could be cited for it. Okay, so again, decriminalization is not legalization. The drugs are still against the law. But the sanction that would be attributed would be relatively minor, such as a fine or a court-ordered mandate for therapy. This has been done in a number of different European countries, Portugal being the most notable of these, which decriminalized all drugs in 2001 and to mostly positive outcomes. Vancouver, BC also did this relatively recently, beginning earlier this year in 2024. So what was the problem with 110? So 110 failed, or at least it was characterized by various serious problems because basically, first off, there was two major parts to the legislation. The first of these was that we would decriminalize all drugs in Oregon. And then in response to this, there would be an investment of large additional sums of money into drug treatment and the provision of drug treatment to people affected, diverting this money from law enforcement and corrections costs in part, and also then partly from marijuana revenues, which are legal in Oregon, of course. Most of this step two part of the policy was supposed to roll out between 3 months and a year after 110 passed, which was itself a very, very aggressive timeline. And it basically never happened. All right. It just started to begin to roll out. The money's just started to be dispersed, and some of these services started to become available in early 2024. This took too long. There was too much harm and disorder in the central CBD of Portland in particular, but in a number of other areas as well. And voters lost patience with it. So there was a lot of political pushback. The same type of clumsy rollout occurred with regard to marijuana legalization. There were major infrastructure and supply problems early on the rollout of marijuana legalization in Colorado and Washington and Oregon. Just as an example, people were lined up to buy weed outside of these legal dispensaries early on, but there was no supply. And so you had all sorts of illegal vendors out there selling weed to people in front of these. And it was a media circus. It was embarrassing, and people were reasonably criticized for this. The lesson that was learned was plan for it. All right. And so a number of states in response to this, including Vermont was the first one, began to legalize. They would look at what the sort of voter will was and read the writing on the wall. And they would then legalize via a legislative mandate, not a ballot initiative. And that would give them time to basically set up the infrastructure and roll it out in an organized fashion. Okay, and so this has worked better in states that have done it since. 110 obviously did not do this, and the decriminalization of hard drugs is a much more distinct, significant policy change than is marijuana legalization. Users of these drugs are not the same persons. The people involved do not have the same level of problems or pose the same level of burdens to society or have the same needs. And so it's really important in this particular area to especially plan for it, and it wasn't done. The second major issue with regard to this was that Measure 110's handling of public drug use, meaning using drugs openly in public, which is not part of decriminalization, essentially de facto legalized it. All right, and this was a really big mistake. What happened is that 110 allowed for the ticketing of drug possession with a fine of up to $100. Okay, that would be waived if people contacted a 24/7 hotline that put them in touch with treatment. So that was the diversionary type of outcome. Almost nobody used this helpline. This was just following some of the stuff around George Floyd. There was a major, we were in the midst of COVID. There was really no consequence or fallback plan to this, and eventually police just stopped issuing tickets. Public drug use became very, very common, especially in the Portland urban area, but in other areas such as Eugene and Medford. And there was just a very, very large population that was, using drugs publicly in this, and it just had a number of consequences with respect to property crime, made things very unsightly. There was an increase in homelessness, which again, data are not excellent on how much of 110 was the reason for the growing homeless in Portland, but there's ample anecdotal evidence that was part of the case. And essentially, these two things, this long wait and the growing problems without really any answer to it, eliminated any type of political support for it, and it was reversed earlier this year. So a big takeaway from this is, just again, considering the legislative versus the voter mandate for this, have an appropriate timeline, plan for it, and then evaluate it. We really can't take much from this. We can take from it that this is a way you don't do it. But we can't really evaluate it real accurately in terms of what it would be like if we rolled it out in a more controlled fashion and we're able to collect good data on it. So I will leave it at that point now.
Thank you, Scott. We'll take the questions at the end. Alex?
All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. I think it says you're still sharing, Scott. If you can stop, it'll then.
Thank you.
And thank you for that presentation. I grew up in Seattle and around the Pacific Northwest, and was curious to hear more about some perspective on how that was rolled out, because I'd read a little bit about it, but hadn't too much other than just news headlines and whatnot. Let me see.
Seattle also pretty significant issues with it, but obviously not decriminalization.
Can everyone see my screen? Is that sharing?
Yeah.
All right. All right. So my name's Alex. I am a first-year sociology PhD student at UCSF, which still kind of seems wild to say. But I am presenting on some of my research that I did in undergrad that was qualitative interviews titled Impacts of Punitive Measures for Relapse on Individuals with SUDs. And what kind of started me wanting to do some of this research was working in substance use treatment for quite a few years and just seeing a lot of the ways that it didn't really work and how a lot of the things that were supposed to be treatment were mostly just more incarceration or punishment or forms of punishment. So starting off, what are punitive measures? Punitive, inflicting or intended as punishment. This includes things like arrest, incarceration, probation, parole, or other monitoring, loss of access to resources. This also includes social standing, things like stigma. It also includes limiting options for employment, housing, banking, and et cetera. California used to limit your access to things like food stamps or general assistance. If you ever had a drug charge, you are no longer ever eligible for food stamps. They've repealed that quite a few years ago, but a lot of states still are have similar laws where you aren't eligible for things like public housing or food stamps and stuff if you've ever had any sort of drug charge. The reason I actually included this slide is I was kind of surprised when I was going through the IRB at my previous institution. I got a lot of pushback on using the term punitive measures, and I actually had to quote the Department of Justice that prison is used as punishment. I was kind of surprised. Some of the people's takes saying that things like incarceration for substance use was just an accountability measure, or that incarceration itself was the treatment, which kind of played into my study more, but I was amazed that I had to quote the Department of Justice saying that prison is punishment. And then, so what is a substance use disorder? It is the clinical term. I'm actually not a huge fan of the term substance use disorder, but it is the clinical term for addiction or alcoholism or drug abuse. It's classified as a mental health condition. It's in the DSM-5. It was included as addiction in the original DSM in 1952. It's characterized by ongoing substance use despite negative consequences, developing a tolerance for the substance and needing more for the desired effect, preoccupation with substance use, and withdrawal of some sort. That doesn't have to be physical withdrawals, but when you cease using drugs, some sort of withdrawal. And usually when you're diagnosing someone, there's a set of 11 questions that you ask, and they fall into some of these categories. If they answer, 2 or more, it's mild. 4 or more, I think. I haven't done the actual analysis or intakes in quite a few years now, but and that's how they clinically diagnosed you with a substance use disorder. And one of the surprising things I came across when I first started looking into the punishment and legality of substance use is it illegal to punish someone for having a substance use disorder? And I actually found it's kind of a gray area of yes and no, at least in California. And in 1962, in a Supreme Court case, Robinson versus California, there was a 6-2 decision authored by Justice Potter Stewart. And they held that laws imprisoning persons afflicted with, quote, the illness of narcotic addiction inflicted cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the 8th and 14th Amendments. And the court likened the law to one making it a criminal offense to, quote, be mentally ill, a leper, or to be afflicted with a venereal disease, and argued that the state could not punish persons merely because of their status of addiction. And this was written in 1962, and it reads like it was definitely written in 1962. And it doesn't designate drug possession, but I was surprised to find that back in the 60s, there actually was a Supreme Court decision saying it wasn't legal to criminalize or punish someone strictly for having a substance use disorder, which especially in the 80s and 90s, they would say if someone was under the influence, that was internal possession and you could be arrested, not even for being intoxicated and acting unruly, but just for if you knew, if you were known to have a substance use disorder and they believed you were under the influence whatsoever, even if you weren't disruptive, they would use that as internal possession. You can be arrested for that. That hasn't really happened in quite a few years, but that was big in the 80s and 90s. So when I was looking through previous literature, what was there? And there wasn't very much. I was looking at this from looking at incarceration as a treatment modality in itself. And there's a lot of literature on treatment outcomes, the effectiveness of harm reduction, the fact that people on probation or parole do a lot better when they're offered treatment, that diversion oftentimes does work really well, but there wasn't any studies that I could find that looked specifically of the effectiveness of punitive measures as a treatment modality for relapse or substance use disorders. And that kind of found that alarming, as that's the #1 way that our country deals with substance use is people get involved in the legal system. And so what is this study? Again, I looked at what are the impacts of using punitive measures on individuals experiencing substance use disorders, and I focused specifically around relapse. I wanted to do that because that meant someone already had some sort of acknowledgement of substance use, they had some clean time, and they were, for this study, in some way involved with the legal system. I looked at the other life impacts and the perceived effectiveness. I did 25 semi-structured 45-minute to 2-hour interviews, and I interviewed 2 populations. I interviewed people with substance use disorders and experience with punitive measures, past or present. There was a total of 12 people that fell under that camp. And then I interviewed individuals working in the substance use disorder treatment field, and there were 13 professionals working in the field. And that included case managers, substance use counselors, therapists, LMFTs, and LCSWs primarily. And so my study, I came at this from the perspective of the purpose of a system is what it does, sort of quoting Stafford Beer, the old systems analyst of, it doesn't matter what you say a system does, but let's look at what it actually does. And we use incarceration as the #1 way to deal with mental health conditions as well as substance use, especially for the poor. I was looking specifically at punitive interventions in incarceration itself as a treatment modality, and that is integral part of penal medicine, palliative care, and poverty governance. Not that a lot of times now we look at things like the California Department of Corrections and rehabilitation. They added the R at the end of it for it to be rehabilitation, as though the rehabilitation is separate from the incarceration. And I, in the study, was saying it's all rolled into one. That's how we deal with it. So I use selective and snowball sampling for multiple points. Having worked in substance use treatment, I reached out to quite a few people that I had worked with in the past, and then snowballed from there, mostly in the county of Alameda. Excuse me. But I did end up interviewing some people in Chicago and Baltimore and one person in Florida. So it was mostly in California, but there was a number of people outside of California. All the interviews were recorded through Zoom and transcribed through Panopto's auto transcribe feature, coded and deduced, identified themes, and gave values to answers regarding punitive measures ranging from very beneficial to very detrimental. And so the results part, were they effectively? Overwhelmingly no. That's kind of what I expected. But there were some caveats and interesting things that I was able to find from the interviews that I kind of didn't expect. So currently all the participants with substance use disorders were sober, and none contributed their sobriety currently to any of the punitive measures. I would like to interview people outside of currently being sober, but just because of the limitation of the study and my resources, I wasn't able to get access to institutions. I did visit some needle exchanges and interview some people, but I wasn't able to really use any of the data that I got from people who are currently using. And many stated that they were more likely to use substances after the application of punishments, and they removed feelings of agency or self-efficacy in one's life around their substance use. So I have a couple quotes here. I usually try to shy away from long quotes, but I felt some of these were really powerful. This is from an individual who'd been sober about 20 years, but he was talking about back when he had been going in and out of incarceration. He said, every time I got released, I was lost and confused and felt more withdrawn and disconnected from the world than I did before. And I started becoming more antisocial. I was kind of getting this feeling like I'm never going to be able to make it. I'm never going to be able to pull it together. And so, yeah, it was that. When you don't have hope, when there's no help for something like that, there's no hope. There was a theme of making things worse and adding additional barriers in life and sobriety. This was an individual who was talking about as they were trying to get sober after getting released, they had gotten a DUI and they had reached out. And so all of the things that I ever got violated for was being under the influence. I got my very first DUI. I got sent to court for a DUI and I called them. He was talking about a parole officer and told them, I said, I need help. I told him about the DUI. I told him I'm kind of falling apart out here. I'm back using. I got a DUI and I'm not making it. I just need some help. I don't know if there's anything that you can do to help me, but I need help. I actually called him and did that, which was a big step for me because I always believed you never talk to these guys about anything. And he said, well, come on in and we'll talk about it. So I trusted him. I went in there and they arrested me. They sent me to Kirkland, which was a prison in the area, for a year for that. And then I got out and it was worse because he still had to deal with the DUI. That was strictly just for his parole violation. He did get sober. He contributed to eventually ending up in an outpatient facility that he stated was exceptionally not punitive. And this individual had been sober for about 15 years now. The punitive measures were often harmful and dangerous themselves or caused other dangerous circumstances in the lives of the individuals affected. This was both while in custody as well as outside of custody. This is a quote from someone who had just been released actually up in Oregon. In the middle of winter, he was released from a drug possession charge in the snow. And he said, I remember one time I thought I was going to die from my addiction. I thought I was actually going to freeze to death outside. I remember me and my girlfriend, we were up in Oregon in the snow, and I remember sitting on the cement on the side of the road trying to hitchhike to get a ride just so I could get inside of a car actually to get warm. I remember thinking I could just fall to the side there and die and no one would even care. They just kept driving by so that more and more that feeling of nobody caring kept building. There was a theme of derailing progress during the treatment process through, quote, extra punishments. This was from actually one of the people I'd interviewed that was from out of California, and they were trying to be able to see their kid. So I was doing everything right and had 3 months left on my 18th month probation. I hadn't been able to see my kid in over a year, so I saved up and spent all of my money on a lawyer and asked to go in front of the judge to ask for a pass to go out of state to see him. The judge said that it was inappropriate for me to ask for special treatment and that it showed I hadn't learned my lesson. So he extended my probation another 18 months. It ended up being 3 years without seeing my son. And that was without any probation or violations. It was just strictly on, it was inappropriate to ask. Continued, so drugs readily available in jails and prisons. There's very limited, if any, treatment offered. Some participants increased drug use and severity of substance use while incarcerated. One of the big things in prison systems is that you don't have access to what type of drugs or your route of administration that you'd like. So one participant entered prison at 15, having only drank alcohol and smoked marijuana. And he left prison at 35, intravenously using methamphetamines and opiates. And he stated that that was strictly because methamphetamine was the #1 drug that was smuggled into prison, and that people considered it a waste to do anything but shoot it up because it wasn't the most efficient way to ingest it. And another big thing that came up was the post-incarceration syndrome, which is really, I consider, just an offshoot of PTSD and the psychological impacts of having been incarcerated, especially for extended period of time. The majority of people that I interviewed had spent at least a year to 2 in prison. Some of them, such as the participant that was just mentioned that left at 35 intravenously using methamphetamines and opiates, had spent a little over 20 years in prison. One of the big themes that came up, this was mostly through the substance use professionals, was talking about themes of the helpers within punitive systems and how they oftentimes fought any of the treatment that was being offered. That was systems like CPS, parole and probation. These were some of the quotes that some of the substance use counselors and therapists had mentioned, that they had heard things like CPS workers and probation officers mention when it came to like giving bus passes or giving resources. They would just sell them anyways. They'll use them for drugs. They aren't going to do well either way. And there was this really big reluctance for many of these people in the punitive system to give any resources to anyone that was dealing with substance use, because they had this mindset that they were going to just use it for drugs anyway and it wouldn't help. And these weren't the necessarily court employees. These were the specific people like caseworkers for reunification court that are supposed to be helping. And there's a theme of substance use treatment workers having to fight the punitive measures and spending a majority of their time spent trying to navigate bureaucracies within these penal systems. Some of the themes that came up talking to the substance use treatment professionals was stigma. 11 out of 13 treatment professionals stated that stigma and diminishing self-worth was a huge issue with the punitive measures. And 9 out of 13 professionals mentioned trauma-informed care. And one stated this when asked to expand, provided a very empathetic, trauma-informed setting for them where they feel valued and cared for, I think is probably the most significant piece to a therapeutic alliance for the clients. Anything punitive would serve zero purpose as far as a therapeutic approach is concerned. So I think if I had to pick one thing that works that I want to see more of, it would be a very empathetic, trauma-informed alliance with the client. And when I asked, is it possible to have trauma-informed care and punitive measures together, 12 out of the 13 professionals stated it is not possible. And one was quoted, I love this quote, "Is that a serious question? I don't know how you would do that. Like those two things are the exact opposite of each other." Some answers lean towards approaches not being mutually exclusive. One participant stated that they've seen both approaches used well together, but this was more of a plea bargain. That it was kind of like, if we have to deal with these court systems, we can still provide some treatment and get good results, but it wasn't because these things were actually helping. So there's this theme of punitive measures versus accountability. Are they same? And that kind of goes back to the IRB board saying that the incarceration itself was accountability measure. What is the proper ratio? And every single person that I interviewed said there was much too much focus on the punishment, and there was little, if any, on rehabilitation or actual accountability. Some of the other themes that came up was the limited scope and ability to assist clients in substance use treatment. Everything has to be on a treatment plan. If something new comes up, say a client becomes unhoused all of a sudden, you can't discuss that with them or help them with that because that's not on their substance use treatment plan. You're not able to give them rides to appointments, even if it's for their mandated treatment, long wait times and process times. And I've personally seen it places I've worked where there would be, people on probation or parole that are homeless that call in every day trying to get into treatment. They're told they have 3 to 4 months to wait for the next open bed. And at this point, they're automatically in violation of parole because they usually have 7 days to get within treatment. And these aspects and limitations are not present for punitive measures. The cops don't have to get permission to give rides or to wait 3 months to arrest someone. And so some of the shortcomings and points for future research, this was a very small study. It was done in undergrad. Looking back, a lot of it, I've sort of, this was a couple of years ago that I did this, and looking back, I'm like, oh, I would have approached this differently. I would have probably applied some different theories to these sort of approaches and the questions that I asked. But I think the main takeaway that I got from a lot of the participants and just general interviews was that the people who were subjected to some of the worst cases of punishment and had access to some of the least amount of actual treatment really wanted their pain to be heard. They wanted to, there's this mindset that people deserve a lot of these things. And hearing mothers who don't have access to their children, or hearing people who were, thinking they're going to die in the snow. They were really just wanted to be heard that, like, I'm legitimately trying and I want this to be seen as like a real issue. And a lot of times it seems like that's not really the case in the public discourse around substance use and what's considered treatment, what's considered accountability, what's considered, it's separate categories, but really it was kind of all the same. I think that's all that I have. So I'm going to pass it back over.
Let me see how we will take the questions. Let me look at the chat. Could you remove the sharing, please?
Oh, yes.
Thank you. Okay. Let me look at that. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Yes. Latina?
Sure. Thanks both Scott and Alex for your presentations. Something that you said, Scott, really resonated at the beginning, which is like sort of this idea that crime needs to have a victim, and that this might like affect how we understand addictions and sort of crimes related to drug possession or use. And I was wondering, both Scott and Alex, if maybe you had thoughts on sort of how like that carceral logic of like crime must have a perpetrator and a victim sort of feeds into the phenomenon that you both are interested in looking at. Scott, I think you are muted.
Thank you again. Luddite, terrible the stuff. Thanks. I'll jump in first if that's okay, Alex. If I understand the question right, yeah, it's just a way of kind of conceptualizing, crimes and what necessitates significant criminal justice response. Certainly, there are some crimes in society that absolutely require significant criminal justice response. And those are some of the ones that I talked about. When we're getting into some of these the areas so-called victimless crimes, sometimes called public order crimes, these are things where you have some type of consensual action that is thought to have secondary consequences. So gambling is one, obviously drugs is one, carrying guns is one in certain areas. These are things where people are punished because what they're doing is in some way thought to be, posing a risk or that will have secondary consequences. And in some cases that is correct, but it's just acknowledging that that's a pretty big leap, and that there are different tiers of things in terms of severity. And when you're talking about incarcerating somebody possessing a substance that you intend to use for yourself, again, at small quantities, we're not talking dealing, we're talking possession. It's a very serious consequence to incarcerate somebody with very long lasting consequences for that individual and for society. And so reconceptualizing how we do that is important. We have pulled back on that some degree. I think mostly that's budgetary. It's happened over the last decade, 15 years, and probably more than anything else, I think it's budgetary. It's just really expensive to incarcerate people. So we're making maybe better, more fiscally important choices.
Yeah, a lot of times people mention that drug use is a victimless crime or that there isn't like a specific victim. And I think that when I think of that framing, I look at where most laws stem from. And of course, there's, laws against violence and things, but the majority of laws are to protect private property. And a majority of detaining people a lot of times isn't because they're an inherent violent risk to society, it's because they've damaged private property or in some way challenge societal norms. And I think a lot of the idea of how substance use is looked at specifically even goes to, there's a big backlash against a lot of the vocabulary around substance abuse and everything that, if you look at a lot of other mental health conditions, you don't say like depression abuse, like it's like the substance itself has more rights than the individual using it, like you're abusing the substance. And this sort of idea of the drug use itself being a malicious act, and kind of to what Scott mentioned too, is that the severity a lot of times is not in line with like what the actual action is. Like incarceration is extremely expensive. And if you look at like even the scale of property crimes to the point where you actually get long periods of incarceration, I would say the severity of property crimes and different crimes to get that level of incarceration is much more severe than a lot of times what just repeat petty drug offenses are. So.
We have a question in chat. This is from Catherine. It says, hello, thanks so much for this presentation. I worked in social services for 7 years before returning to school. I'm curious if you all have any thoughts about how the concept of enabling fits in with this work and how the concept is used against providers who do not support punitive measures.
I'm sorry, Matt, could you repeat that? I think I didn't really understand the question.
Okay. Catherine, would you like to ask it yourself?
Yeah, I was curious, and this is, I guess, more related to the second presenter about the concept of enabling when we're talking about treatment and criminalization and how that fits in with the concepts of trauma-informed care and when people are thinking about how to handle substance use.
Yeah, so a lot of times the idea of enabling comes up a lot, especially with harm reduction and with things that don't specifically enforce or require abstinence immediately and right away. My response to that a lot of times is just like, well, I mean, drug use happens either way. Like good things, drugs are illegal. Now no one uses them, right? Well, whether there's legality or more roadblocks in the way, people are going to use drugs. And I would say, if anything, you're enabling safe use as opposed to through the more restrictive regulations or things that push abstinence only. What you're not enabling use, you're enabling more harmful or more dangerous use. If you don't have access to clean needles, it's not that people are going to stop using intravenous drugs. They're just going to not have access to clean needles when they do use them. I think the Just Say No and DARE programs are a perfect example where they had to stop doing the DARE program because they found people who went through them were actually more likely to use drugs than people who didn't. And so a lot of times the idea of giving accurate or harm reduction information as enabling doesn't look at the whole landscape that this drug use is going to be taking place either way. And when you look at it a public health issue, it's actually something that can then be addressed from a public health perspective, as opposed to a criminal issue.
And if I could sneak in and ask a question real quick, I know Scott has to leave in a few seconds to get across campus for a class, but I wanted to ask a question a bit about kind of this, kind of the bias in the application of current punishments and the use the kind of over application of incarcerations and things like that for drug related crimes, for possession, or for people who are considered users, and how that both racial, socioeconomic status, and kind of those things creates more barriers for those folks in that application.
If I understand the question right, yeah, it's substantial. Obviously, there's really significant racial and social class biases in the system across a variety of things. Drug use is one of the most discretionarily enforced forms of crime that there is. Meaning where it's enforced, on who it's enforced. We don't have things where like somebody investigates, oh, well, you committed a armed robbery, so we're going to just decide whether or not to charge you in this case. That happened to me and friends of mine when I was growing up during the war on drugs, regularly, and you see enforcement in areas where there's a lot of lack of power. All right. You don't see a lot of enforcement on, for example, college campuses where you're going to have some of the highest rates of drug use anywhere in the country. Right. It happens at every level, and it tends to get worse at every level. So at stop, charge, length of sentence, et cetera. And a lot of that has to do with the role of social class in our system, ability to, afford a private attorney, create impediments for the system, and force plea bargaining, basically. And when you don't have that, when you don't have those types of resources, or you can't draw on somebody that has those types of resources, you're going to suffer more. All right. So it's twofold. It's just, as I said before, it's problematic in a number of ways, right? And it really undermines any kind of trust in the police, right? And that is also has a variety of, secondary and tertiary consequences. I'm sorry, I have to jump off it as you mentioned and run to class. Alex, I can email you this, but Gabor Mate, have you read Gabor Mate's work on trauma? Right? Yeah. So I think a lot of his stuff definitely resonates with your work as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
We have a few more minutes. Any other questions for Alex? Not seeing any chats or chats. Well, this was a great presentation. I learned a lot. And I thank you greatly for sharing your research, your insights. And I thank everybody for joining us on this important talk on drug and policy use. And may everybody have a great weekend. And nos guachamos. Take care, everybody. Okay.
Thank you, everybody, for being a part of this. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Manuel, for hosting. Thank you, Dwayne Plaza, our president. Thank you very much for opening this space for us to have this genuine discussion. And we do have a couple minutes technically left, an hour. I don't know if Dwayne, if you want to say a few words just to.
Sure. Thank you, Jarvis. I just want to thank everyone for being part of this. We are looking for some presenters for January, February. So if you have any very interesting research or topics that you would like to bring to the next set of lightning talks, please contact me directly, and we'll try to put you into a theme. Again, as you can see, the structure is one where you get 15 minutes to present on your thematic area, and we try to match you with somebody else who's doing similar work, but we try to match senior and junior folks in a model where some junior folks get a chance to present with senior folks. And if you think about it, these panels so far have been as highly attended as we'd have panels in the actual conference. So this is kind of a pre-situation to a conference. So I would like to highly encourage people to contact me, and please continue on with our intellectual development as an association. We need to think about ourselves as more than just the conference. So intellectualism doesn't stop after the conference is finished. And it's also an opportunity for you to share your ideas and also your research, and have an audience that is very supportive. We're not conflictual, and get some good advice on maybe developing your ideas further. So on that note, Jarvis, I want to thank you also for your hosting. You've done a wonderful job as usual. Remind everyone that this will be a recording that will be put up on the website. And have a great holiday, everyone, however you celebrate it in December. And we'll have more information about our fourth lightning talk coming up very soon. Great. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you also, Manuel, for all that you did.
Wayne, thank you. This was a good idea. Jarvis, you conceptualized it, Wayne, and Jarvis, you've operationalized it. They're great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. See you soon.
Bye, everybody.
See you soon.
Bye-bye. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.